Again, good morning everybody. So to begin with my topic for today about Gestalt psychology, first we are going to define and give the etymology of the word Gestalt for you to have a knowledge about it. So what is Gestalt psychology? So a lot of people perceive that Gestalt psychology is a psychological principle that were developed by a person whose name is Gestalt. But in fact, Gestalt is actually a German word which means shape, figure, or form, and sometimes it is also interpreted by as pattern or configuration. One of the most Gestalt quote is that the whole is greater than its part. However, some mention that this statement has been misquoted and it is originally the whole is other than the sum of its part. Gestalt psychology has been influential and monumental in many fields, such as design of logos, websites, and social media sites, also in architecture, such as in creating depth and space. The Gestalt psychology school of thought looks at the human mind and behavior as a whole. The overarching assumption of Gestalt psychology is that when we try to make sense of the world around us, we do not simply focus on every small concept or component. Instead, our mind tends to perceive object as part of greater whole and elements of more complex system, which is going to be tackled further in this lesson. So, this Gestalt school of psychology played a major role in the modern development of the study of human sensation and perception. So, to continue, we are going now to discuss the timelines of how and who the founders of these theories are. So, back in Germany, philosophical views held that consciousness cannot be reduced to sensory stimulation and conscious experience is different from the elements that compose it. Ernst Mach postulated that two perceptions, space form and time form, appeared to be independent of the particular elements that compose them. Mach and Ehrenfels proposed that form is something that emerges from elements of sensation. Next is the the theory of William James, who postulated that the integral stream of consciousness was the focus of psychology in contrast to isolated mental elements which compose the mind. So again, back in Germany, Bretagne and Stamper specifically influential on the Gestalt test, and those first Gestalt tests are Max Wettinger, Kurt Kafka, Wolfgang Kohler, which is the student of Stamp. Bretagne and Stamp has proposed act psychology. Act psychology focuses on the acts of perceiving, sensing, or problem solving. The psychologists and the Gestaltists were both phenomenologists who explored that the consciousness as a whole and not as elements. So now I am going to present to you the founders of the theory that we are discussing right now. So first, Max Wertheimer, 1880 to 1943, which is a Czech-born Jew, a student of cult, best known for the idea of imageless thoughts. Studied the five phenomenon with research assistant Kohler and Kafka. A perception of apparent movement when the elements of experience are in fact stationary. Back in the 1912, experimental studies of perception of movement was created by Max Wertheimer, where in this book it states that the perceptions are different than the sensation that comprises them. So next is Mr. Kurt Kafka, which is studying together with Max Wertheimer, wherein he was born and educated in Berlin and earned his PhD in 1909 as a student of Carl Stamp. He worked with Wertheimer in Berlin on the five phenomenon and wrote the several books and articles regarding Gestalt psychology. His perception, wherein his book is titled His Perception, An Introduction to Gestalt Theory, although important, left the impression that Gestaltists were only interested in perception. For our third Gestaltist theorist is Mr. Wolfgang Kohler, 1887 to 1967. Again, was Stamp's student in Berlin. Back in 1913, Kohler was the director of Russian Academy of Science Anthropoid Research Station and wrote The Mentality of Tapes in 1917, challenged trial and error theories of problem solving in animals. Kohler concluded chimps experience the insight, aha experience in which having realized an answer to a problem that they proceed to carry it, but in a way that it was unwaveringly purposeful. Like us humans, when we have that aha moment, aha experience, like when we have the right answers and the wrong answers, and then we saw the correct answer, and then aha, I remember it like that. So it is stated back in the module that there is a Gestalt school which is built by this psychologist, and they have students who rise up again, who rise up better or great than most of the students back in their times. During the Americanization of Gestalt psychology, three founders of Gestalt psychology ended up in America. In 1922, Kurt Kafka left Germany for the US to teach at Smith College until he retired. In 1933, Max Whittimer moved to the United States to escape the Nazi Germany and at the School of Social Research in New York City, where he stayed until his retirement. While in 1935, Wolfgang Kohler moved to the US after a fallout of Nazi region. It was during the time of World War II. And then Wolfgang taught at Swarthmore College outside of Philadelphia until he retired. So, to cite some of the students of Gestalts, which I am pertaining about in the last slide, I just get some students because there are so many students, important students lang with great achievements. First is Rudolf Arnhem, worked with the Gestaltists in Berlin, best known as an art and film theorist. He wrote The Influential Art and Visual Perception. Karl Duncker worked with Gestaltists in Berlin. Again, Duncker studied problem solving and coined the term functional fixedness. Kurt Gestalt received his PhD in Berlin with the Gestaltists, demonstrated the power of full over intersected part, which gave rise to the Gestalt embedded figure test, or EFT. So much for that. So let's go to the Gestalt psychology principles. Gestalt psychology included 8 new critical ideas. First, the field theory. Second is the psychophysical isomorphism, and so on and so forth. First, to study the field theory, Gestaltists proposed that the brain contains structural fields of electrochemical forces, and upon entering a field, sensory data both modify the structure of the field and are modified by the field. Our experiences results to the intersection of the sensory data and the force field in the brain. Cognitive experience result from the fields of brain activity transforming sensory data and giving the data characteristic it otherwise would not be processed. So, cited as Lewin stated, who developed the field theory, human behavior is explained by complex dynamic forces acting on an individual at a given time. Central to this is the concept of life space. This influences the psychological fact, which consists the awareness of internal events, external events, and recollection of prior experiences. Only those facts that are currently present in the life space can influence a person's thinking and behavior biologically and psychologically needs cause tension. Next is the psychophysical isomorphism, wherein the force fields in the brain transform incoming sensory data, and that is the transformed data that we experience consciously. Isomorphism comes from the Greek word meaning similar shape. So, to further elaborate, I am not going to give you this text and so much more, but we are going to jump on the law of organization, wherein we are going to tackle about similarity, proximity, closure, common fate, pregnance, law of pregnance or good figure, and symmetry. These Gestalt principles, first, good figure. Let us tackle this one by one. For good figure, objects grouped together tend to be perceived as single figure. The tendency of the human mind is to simplify. There you can see in the figure that we have a shape, dots with the shape of diamond, and back here, the Olympics, sign of Olympics, which gives us a good figure. similarity, objects tend to be grouped together if they are similar. In similarity, you can see in the picture that if the shapes are similar, the human mind tends to group them together according to their shapes. For example, if we see 4 triangles and 4 circles, we tend to group the 4 triangles together and the 4 circles together. In closure, visual connection and continuity between sensitive elements which do not actually touch each other in a composition. So as we can see here in the diagram, in the picture of closure, there is no connecting line, but our mind tends to connect them. Again, when we are children, our parents make this kind of symbols for us to have a better idea of the visual connections. For example, when we are writing our name when we are children, we are little kids, we trace those letters and our mind tend to follow it until we create the figure. Next is proximity, wherein object tends to be grouped together if they are close to each other. Like this. They are close together and we are going to group them together. Next is for continuation, when there is an intersection between 2 or more objects. People tend to perceive each object as a single uninterrupted object. So for continuation, you will see that there is a cross intersection, but as you can see, that is 2 lines matched together. So if that 2 lines is matched together, you can say that it is one figure rather than 2 lines. Next is for symmetry, wherein human minds tend to see the object as a symmetrical shape that form around their center. I will give you another example of that Gestalt principle, wherein we can better understand the idea it wants us to identify. First, for the proximity, like that, as you can see, there are 3 squares and 2 squares here, and we group them according to the closeness of the shapes. Next is similarity, again, same shape, we tend to group them together because they are similar. In closure, here we can see lines, but we tend to draw our minds tend to draw lines because it is what our minds want us to do, to continue the lines even if we didn't see the lines again. And so on and so forth. So the major principle Gestalt theory of learning according to Kolka 2013 wants us to learn is that the learner should be encouraged to discover the underlying nature of topic or a problem. Next is gaps, incongruities, and disturbances are an essential stimulus for learning. Again, back in my example, for example, in continuity, when we are little, our parents or our teachers lets us connect the lines in order for us to easily write our names and identify to whether we are doing correct things or correct shapes in there by their instruction. For number 3, instruction should be based upon the laws of organization. So the strengths and weaknesses of Gestalt Theory for the last part of our lesson. So the strengths and weaknesses for mathematics teaching and learning in application to future educator. Gestalt principles are actually applied in many mathematics topics, especially in those that require visual perception, such as in three-dimensional shape, geometry, lines, and angles of the graphs. However, the application may be intrinsic, which is usually in the process of drawing shapes and in complex problem solving that involves visualization. It is very rare to observe a mathematics class that applies the Gestalt principles explicitly in the classroom. Introducing Gestalt principles into the math classroom can bring some benefits to students, our benefits. One is that it can allow students to observe how psychology is inherent involved in mathematics, specifically in those related with shapes and space. Another is that it can allow students to observe how mathematics is applied in careers. In future, students will use Gestalt principles in architecture and advertising. In fact, in advertising, again, Gestalt principles are central in creative designs of company logos. That's it, yes. So, to end my lesson, I hope you understand something, and if you have queries or something to ask, you can send a personal message to me, or to clear something, you can just drop by on my messenger and give me an insight to whether you understand the lesson or not. Thank you for listening.